Welcome to this training about incorporating environmental justice principles and requirements into the sociocultural effects evaluation process. Facilitating equitable outcomes is part of a Florida Department of Transportation video series providing guidance for sociocultural effects evaluations for transportation projects. This video is part 3 of a 3-part Facilitating Equitable Outcomes training. Part 1 covered the foundations of environmental justice and its role in transportation decision-making. Part 2 explored the scope of environmental justice analysis, including definitions for key terms. This video builds on the concepts presented in Parts 1 and 2 and includes a methodology for project-level environmental justice analysis. The first thing to know about performing an environmental justice analysis is that there is no uniform methodology for it. Neither the Environmental Justice Executive Order or the DOT Order for Environmental Justice prescribe any specific format or standard formula. However, we can rely on guiding principles to ensure that our efforts will be effective. When developing an approach and considering the level of detail for the analysis, think about the nature of the project, including the phase and potential for adverse effects, especially those that appear to be significant. The demographic composition of an affected area is of course a primary factor. We need to identify population groups that could be impacted by the project. We also need to consider the potential for the layering of adverse effects on an environmental justice population that when combined rise to the level of high and adverse. In the same vein, we want to be attentive to any interrelated social, cultural, historical, or economic factors that could amplify adverse effects. Effective public engagement is integral to reliable analyses and recommendations, particularly as related to the distribution of project effects, both beneficial and adverse, the severity of effects, and identifying community-endorsed solutions to disproportionately high and adverse effects. Early engagement of the affected public allows the project to be developed with the fullness of information and to avoid any late-phase surprises. We also want to be aware of potential barriers to public participation in the project, such as language and literacy, so no group is unintentionally excluded from participating. Environmental justice analysis supports, and is supported by, the Project Public Involvement Program, or PIP. Each is informed by and responds to the activities and outcomes of the other. To demonstrate, this slide shows the transfer of information between the sociocultural effects evaluation, when the environmental justice analysis is performed, and the PIP. Initially, the results of the study area demographic analysis is shared with the public involvement arm of the project team, so the information can inform the PIP. If EJ-related issues are revealed during the sociocultural effects evaluation, the public involvement team are consulted about any need for additional community outreach. For example, focus group meetings with an affected community could be a strategy for vetting potential mitigation strategies to address a potential adverse effect. The sequence of questions I'm about to show on this slide represent the major steps involved in performing an environmental justice analysis. First, we set out to learn about the study area demographics and where environmental justice populations are located. Second, we map the footprint of any potential adverse effects. Then, by comparing the responses to questions 1 and 2, we get a sense of how adverse effects are distributed amongst the study area population. For adverse effects found to be disproportionately distributed to an environmental justice population, we assess the severity of adverse effects. Step 5 serves to find solutions to any disproportionately high and adverse effects. And finally, in Step 6, our analysis findings are documented to support project decision-making. The primary steps and decision points for environmental justice analysis are shown in this flowchart. Environmental justice analysis informs and affects the full range of issues investigated in an environmental evaluation. From the demographic analysis prepared during the sociocultural effects evaluation, we will know if an environmental justice population is present in the study area. If it is determined that no environmental justice population is present, this finding is documented and no further analysis is needed. If adverse effects are not anticipated, this finding is documented and no further analysis is needed. However, if the study area has an environmental justice population and potential for adverse effects, An assessment of the effects and their impact on the environmental justice population is conducted. If a potential adverse effect is determined not to be disproportionately high and adverse in its impact on the environmental justice population, this finding is documented and no further analysis is needed. Conversely, if the effect has the potential to be disproportionately high and adverse, appropriate and practicable solutions are identified. And of course, the analysis is informed throughout by appropriately scaled public involvement. In Step 1, we determine if environmental justice populations are present in the study area. Census data is used to obtain the percent minority and non-minority, referred to in the census as white alone, for all of the block groups intersecting the study area. Remember to combine all racial and ethnic minority groups as a single data set when identifying minority populations. Next, obtain data for low-income and non-low-income households. Also pay attention to data indicating the presence of any populations addressed in Title VI and the other non-discrimination legislation. To determine if any block groups in the study area have a minority and/or low-income population per the thresholds I talked about in Part 2 of the training, we will first need to select a reference community. You may recall from Part 2 that the reference community should be the smallest political or census unit encompassing the project study area. When you have selected an appropriate geographic area, obtain the same types of census data that was collected for the study area block groups. To identify a minority population, compare the demographics of the study area block groups to that of the reference community. This pie chart shows the percent minority and white alone populations for a single block group. The minority population in the block group is 45% of the total population, so it does not meet the greater than 50% threshold in the NEPA guidance used to identify a minority population. However, when the block group is compared to the reference community, it reveals that the minority population in the block group of 45% is 10 percentage points greater than the reference community's 35%. Under the alternative, meaningfully greater threshold, the 10 percentage point difference is sufficient to indicate a minority population. This block group would be tagged for further investigation during the environmental justice analysis. The minority population in a reference community can represent the majority of the total population, such as in Miami, Florida. The left pie chart shows a block group with a significant minority population, greater than half of the block group's total population. However, when compared to the reference community's 89% minority population, the block group's minority population is considerably less, a difference of 38 percentage points. In this case, or whenever the minority population of a block group exceeds 50%, we would use the 50% or greater threshold to identify a minority population. To identify block groups with a low-income population, the first step is to obtain the current poverty guidelines published by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. These guidelines are updated annually. Currently, the poverty guideline for a family of 4, which is the household size we use for the analysis, is $23,850. Step 2 is to obtain the latest income data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Communities Survey for all block groups intersecting the study area. The households shown in the ranges generally falling below the Health and Human Services poverty guideline indicate low-income households. To be conservative, select the income ranges below and including the guideline amount. The third step is to estimate the percentage low-income households. In this example, the percentage is 33.9% of the total block group population. The next step is to compare the income data for each block group to the reference community. The block group we looked at in the slide before had 33.9% low-income households, a value greater than the reference community's 22.9%. The difference of 11 percentage points meets the meaningfully greater test, so we would tag this block group as a low-income population for the analysis going forward. After compiling the census data for all of the study area block groups and the reference community, it is helpful to organize it in a simple table like this one. Then note any block groups that met the greater than 50% or meaningfully greater thresholds to indicate which have minority and/or low-income populations. And don't forget to indicate the source of your data, which should be the latest 5-year estimates from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey. In part 2 of the training, I talked about how a sub-threshold environmental justice population does not eliminate the possibility of a disproportionately high and adverse effect on that population. Small concentrations of minority or low-income persons could be masked by aggregated census data, especially when block groups are large in size. Therefore, we do not solely rely on census data because of the potential to overlook small population clusters. Rather, supplement the census data with local information, such as that collected during field review and through community outreach, to help locate sub-threshold environmental justice populations. If a sub-threshold environmental justice population was identified, we'd include that block group to the analysis, being sure to footnote the source of the information. Then map the study area block groups that have minority and/or low-income populations. Step 2 of the environmental justice analysis is to identify the footprint of any adverse effect and to map them with the demographic information to show the area of potential impact. For this example, the adverse effect shown is potential relocations. If there are multiple types of effects, you would make the footprints distinct in the mapping. Then include any past actions that have had an adverse impact on the community. Information on past actions may be available from city or county government, the MPO, or state and federal agencies. Outreach to community groups and organizations can also help with this task. This online database of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is a good source of information on past actions in the study area. EJView includes demographic, health, environmental, and facility level data at the block group and other geographic levels. It has a mapping tool that allows users to draw a study area or select census units for use in generating data reports and maps. For step 3, we look at the distribution of the adverse effect in relation to the environmental justice population block groups and the general population block groups in the study area. Where the effect footprint coincides wholly or partially with an environmental justice population block group, the area is called an EJ effect area. For general population block groups, it is presumed that there will be no disproportionate effects on a minority or low-income population. Be sure to visit the study area to verify this. If it is determined that there are no EJ effect areas, then no further analysis is needed. If that is not the case, we proceed by assessing the relative distribution of adverse effects, including direct, indirect, and cumulative effects, among minority and non-minority populations, and among low-income and non-low-income populations. The left side of this graphic shows the percent minority and non-minority in all potential adverse effect block groups in the study area. The graphic on the right shows the same for unaffected block groups. In this example, minority populations comprise 70% of the population in the affected block groups and 45% of the population in unaffected block groups. This would indicate disproportionate distribution of the adverse effect. The distribution of adverse effects is a metric used to compare relative impact on environmental justice populations and the general population for each project alternative, including the no-build alternative. In Step 4, potential adverse effects that were determined in Step 3 to be predominantly borne by an environmental justice population are assessed for severity. If an effect is high and adverse, that is, appreciably severe or great in magnitude in its negative effect on human health or the environment, it would be considered significant or unacceptable. When gauging the severity of an effect, we consider the totality of potential effects on an environmental justice population, including direct and indirect effects, both beneficial and adverse. The scale or extent of an adverse effect in relation to the local context are other perspectives from which to judge severity. We consider the combined or cumulative effect of those that are project-related and a result of past actions. The expected duration of the effect is a consideration. For example, would the effect be felt only during construction, or would it be longer lived? And finally, we would consider the possibility of avoiding, minimizing, or mitigating the adverse effect. Understanding what is important to affected populations helps us characterize and assess project effects. Whether the study area has a large environmental justice population or a very small one, affected persons must be afforded access to the project decision-making process. Familiarizing yourself with environmental justice communities in the study area will help you anticipate and overcome challenges to outreach and engagement, such as linguistic, literacy, and cultural barriers. Knowing the community will also help in avoiding unintentional discriminatory actions. For complex projects, having a system for organizing and rating potential adverse effects is a good idea, especially when there are potential environmental justice issues. The rating system could show effect types, distribution among environmental justice and non-environmental justice populations, the probability of occurrence, and the severity level for each project alternative. Weighted quantitative and qualitative factors as appropriate would help illuminate the nature and totality of adverse effects. Selection of weighing factors should be informed by community input. A map or map series of the completed matrix would be useful in project decision-making and supporting conclusions in the environmental document. If the analysis reveals the potential for a disproportionately high and adverse effect on an environmental justice population, the next step is to explore solutions. It may be possible to eliminate, reduce, or mitigate a disproportionate effect to the degree that the effect on the environmental justice population becomes proportional to the general population. There are 4 approaches to addressing adverse effects: avoidance, minimization, mitigation, and enhancement. Protocol calls for the exploration of avoidance measures first, followed by minimization, and then finally mitigation. Enhancements do not directly resolve an effect, but serve to bolster the community in ways that would make it more resilient to potential environmental change. When considering a solution to a project effect, we should strive for measures that are proportionate to the level of impact on the affected population. All solutions must be practicable, that is, available and capable of being done after taking into consideration cost, existing technology, and logistics in light of the project's purpose. If a solution would create a more severe adverse effect, it would not be practicable. Another measure of practicability is whether the cost of resolving adverse effects for another project alternative would be extraordinarily high. And likely the most important consideration is how the community feels about the potential solution. So be sure to seek input from affected groups. This slide is going to show 2 outcomes of a finding of a disproportionately high and adverse effect on an environmental justice population. When an effect can be resolved, details of that determination are explained in the environmental document, along with any commitments involved. If the effect cannot be resolved, the lead federal agency is consulted. That agency determines if there is substantial need for the project based on overriding public interest, and whether any of the alternatives have less community effects but substantially higher monetary cost. Usually projects will not get this far in the process. Planning phase screenings tend to cull unsatisfactory projects from further consideration well before this point. The final step is to describe the methodology, findings, and conclusions of the environmental justice analysis in the environmental document. This is typically done in the sections pertaining to the sociocultural environment and the discussion of effects. Detailed information about the methodology is important. Reviewers of the environmental document will be looking for how environmental justice populations were identified, how the reference community and criteria for evaluating effects were selected, and what data was used. The documentation should describe any environmental justice populations as well as the general demographics of the study area, the type, distribution, and severity of potential adverse effects, offsetting project benefits and potential solutions, clearly linking solutions to effects, what the public had to say about effects and solutions, and any commitments for mitigation. You can learn more in Part 2, Chapter 9 of the PD&E Manual, which has a series of sample statements for documenting the results of environmental justice analysis. This concludes the Facilitating Equitable Outcomes training. Links to information resources shown in this video are listed on the next slide and on the department's webpage. Please direct any questions on this or other sociocultural effects topics to Dr. Rusty Endemoser, State Public Involvement and Community Resources Coordinator. Ideas for future training topics are always welcome, so feel free to send us your suggestions. Thank you for viewing this production of the Florida Department of Transportation.